Alright guys, in today's video we're working on a 2004 Chevrolet Cavalier, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be swapping out the rear suspension struts. We're going to be reusing the springs, but we're going to be replacing the strut assembly itself with the new genuine GM. If we take a close look up here at the top, you can see this one's really corroded, long overdue for being replaced. There's supposed to be a piece up here at the top that's broken and rotted away, and it's making a thunking noise when you go over big bumps, so it's way overdue time to do this. Alright guys, we're just putting on a little PB blaster to help with this in case we got any corrosion through the bushing. 18 millimeter. Alright, she's on there. It's typically what you have back here is corrosion. Alright guys, we're going to have to heat this nut up in order to get this loose. Hopefully it's just bound up on the threads and not all corroded inside the bushing, because if it is, we'll have to cut it. Alright, what we're going to do is we're going to heat this up with a bolt buster, which is an inductive heater. It's going to do the same thing as a torch without the fire. Just going to heat this nut up and see if that's our problem. That smoke you see, that's just the PB blaster. Need to get all that burned off. Let's give it a shot. There we go. Now, just in case we've got some of that rubber burning, gonna douse that out. And we'll do the same thing on the passenger side. Alright, same treatment that we did on the driver's side here on the passenger side. Alright, while those 18 millimeter bolts are cooling off, let's go into the trunk. We're in a two-door coupe here, but it's going to be the same for the sedan. We pull this carpet back, and here we can see this top of the strut tower. We got a 13 millimeter nut on the inboard side, and then you can see where two 10 millimeter bolts are threading through a captive nut on the outboard side. So this is the driver's side view. Now the reason there's a nut here is this will allow you to keep this held up when you're installing it or uninstalling it. You pull those two fasteners, then you do the nut last. Let me show you what it looks like on the passenger side. Alright, same deal, pull the carpet down. The passenger side is just the mirror image. 13 millimeter nut on the inboard side, and then two 10 millimeter fasteners protruding through the outboard side. Alright guys, looking in from the outside up past the spring. Hopefully there's enough light for you to see. There's one of the 10 millimeter bolt heads right there. And there's the other one right there. So you pull these two down from the inside wheel well side, and then you go into the trunk and get the 13 millimeter nut. All right, guys, we lost a few minutes because this bolt fell into this little trough area here, right back behind here. So watch out for that. I looked all over for this thing, and it was wedged back in this trough of this plastic fender or wheel liner. So we got one more to pull off, but you can see these are not typically going to have any corrosion on them because they're protected by being in the trunk. It's just the heads. So as long as you don't get any corrosion around the neck, because what could happen if you get corrosion around the neck, they could snap off, and that's really a sucky day when that happens. But this other one should come off real easy. All right, there's number 2. Now let's go after the nut. All right, the best tool I find for this cramped quarters on this particular vehicle is a little 13 millimeter box end ratchet. So you can hear the strut just settled into the lower rear control arm. I'm just going to go ahead and keep working this off. Can't really get an electric ratchet or anything in here. All right, so there's our 13 nut. Now let's go pull our strut out. All right, so we want to pull our 18 millimeter bolt from the lower eyelet out all the way. Then we can lift this out of this control arm, and she just comes out as a complete unit, just like that. So here on the top where you can see, so where the nut goes, this stud is integral to this top housing piece, and then the other bolts go through here into the captive nuts. So we're going to clean up all this dirt, and we're going to go ahead and get it on the spring compressor so that we can get this spring off so we can swap out this center assembly. It's a better view now that we got it off how corroded and damaged it is. All right guys, now let's do the passenger side. Same deal. We've left our 18 millimeter bolt in from where we extracted it from the impact wrench. We'll finish it after we get these 210s pulled out, and then we'll pull the 13 nut just like we did on the driver's side. So switching up here. This guy's getting stuck up there. All right, there's that one. All right. This one, the head was just a little corroded, so we had a little bit of slippage, but it's still a good fastener because there's no corrosion on the fastening side. So we'll clean this up before we reuse it. All right, so coming back to our 18, we'll take the 18 off before we go get the 13 nut now that we got the 210s off. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can just kind of lift up on the lower control arm, or you can get a pry bar in here. Whichever way you go, if you've got the other side off like I do, you're going to need something to support this lower assembly. So you can see over here we've got a jack right here, because once we remove this, there's nothing holding this entire lower control arm bar assembly on. It'll drop on the ground. So have a jack under here, or do one side at a time, because the only thing that's supporting it are these. All right, so we should be able to just lift up on this. So if you look over here, you can see you can lift up on this guy, and you can work this bolt off. You can get into the right position. All right, and then he'll just sit on the jack just like that. Now let's go in the trunk and pull our 13 millimeter nut off so we can remove the passenger side strut assembly. All right, guys, same deal as the driver's side. We're going to work this 13 millimeter nut off. In my case, with a box end ratchet wrench. You can have a helper holding the strut assembly, but as long as it stays centered inside the lower control arm where you pull the bolt off, it's not going anywhere. All right, so pull this off and then we'll come back. All right, with the nut out, we can get this guy extracted up. You can squish him up a little bit out of the lower control arm, and then we can get him out. So on this one, we can see there's a lot of corrosion affecting the upper strut mount. So on this one, not just the shock's going to have to be replaced, but the entire mount is going to have to be replaced. All right, the next thing we got to do is coming back to the driver's side, put our spring compressor on here, get the spring compressed so that we can separate these pieces. After we get it compressed, there's a couple of safety nuts on this design. There's all different kinds of these spring compressors. I prefer this type here. I'll put a link down in the description if you're interested. This is a really heavy-duty one rather than those little Widowmaker types. But we're going to compress it until we can move it. At that point, we know we've got it enough where we can separate these pieces safely. On this particular model, there's a rubber cap on the top here that we're going to have to get removed in order to access the fastener that we need to remove to separate these pieces. Just trying to get this thing off without it ripping. Come on, there we go. All right, one less part to have to replace. So now we'll just remove this bolt, this nut here. You can see that the top of the strut shaft is got flats on it so that you can put a tool on here to keep it from spinning. So you're going to need a tool that suitably work for that, as well as a socket for this. All right, guys, before we separate this, there's a couple of things we want to take note of. So on the bottom, there's an indentation in the strut itself that tells you how to align the lower part of the spring. All right, so we don't have to worry about that. But on the upper part, it's not necessarily going to be a mark like that. And since we're going to plan on reusing this strut mount here, because there's nothing wrong with it, at least so far, till we get it off, we won't know for sure, but we're going to assume it's reusable. We're going to mark the position of the spring to this stud here, right? So that will help make sure that we get it back in the same position. That's just to avoid any potential sounds or noises from this worn strut that's still serviceable. Excuse me, a strut mount versus one that's not. All right, the best tool for removing this nut is going to be an offset 15. That way you got one of these bends in it so that you can get into this recessed area, and then whatever you can to grab the top piece once we get it going. I'm probably just going to use a crescent wrench for this. Keep the spring oriented like this so that if something does fail on you, it's going to go away from you in one direction or the other. See if we can get the torque broke on this, then it'll start going pretty easy. There we go. All right. Fortunately, this top piece here is protected from the elements so it doesn't get corroded. So I get this corrected a little bit there. And remember, guys, you've got to make sure that the spring compressor is safety protected, everything's in position, the nuts are done, because once you take this off, things are going to have a tendency to go flying if you don't have it compressed all the way. All right. All right, so she's a little stubborn, so I'm just going to go get a rubber mallet and give her a tap. Just being gentle with all this because we want to salvage it. All right. So what we're looking for on the mount here, this one does have a little bit of corrosion in the corner, but this is a car from 2004, so right, no surprise. But what we want to make sure of is that the rubber that holds in the center of this mount, this particular kind of mount doesn't use a bearing. It's just a rubber bushing type of mount. No cracks, no tears. That's what we're looking for. So this one here is not the source of the sound. I suspect the sound was coming from the one on the passenger side that we saw that was in a lot worse shape. So this guy we can clean up and reuse for sure. Now with this out of the way and our paint marked, we can pull the strut assembly out from the spring. You can see we got all kinds of broken pieces coming out of here. It's just stuck on this bellows piece here. Let me see if I can work it past the So that's a piece that broke internally. There's another piece that broke internally. Just working our little bellows past the spring tool. There we go. It's another piece that broke internally. Inside here is a kind of a shock absorber piece. Need to be able to get that separated. It's kind of wedged on there at the moment. Let me get that separated off. But this piece we can reuse. There's nothing wrong with this. I mean, ideally, you might want to put another one on there just because there's a little hole in it, but I wouldn't bother for a vehicle this old. I'm going to have to get some lubricant in here to let this go. This top piece here is just kind of binding on the shaft. All right, so now we got this separated. So the way these pieces would have went together, this piece here that's all broken would have been mounted on to the shock like this. And it ends up having these three little indentations, one there, and one there. And those fit into here, here, and here and hold the bottom part of this bellows. To separate this and get the bumper out, you can spray some silicone. You want to spray something in here that's not petroleum based. This center kind of foam is real sensitive to that kind of crap. Should be able to, there we get it going. And then once it's going, we should be able to pull this off like that. All right, so this piece, this little spacer, there's the bottom of the bellows, and then it's going to be a little bit harder to fish this guy out, but he kind of fits into this ridge down here. So get you a trim tool and just push him out. Of course, it's all slippery now from the silicone, so just give me a moment here. There we go. All right, so there's our pieces. Now, this guy's fine, and we can reuse him. He's got, some tears on the top. Typically what happens is they just disintegrate. And if yours disintegrates, I had one on hand here in case I needed it. It's a part number 2212-9486. So that's the replacement for this guy. But this guy is okay. It doesn't matter that he's got some nicks on him, right? It's a 2004, guys. It's a Cavalier, so we just want it functional. So we're going to push this back in, and we're going to reassemble these pieces. Now let me show you what we're going to do about the strut mount. Make sure this piece sits in like that. We'll lube this up again. I'm just using some spray silicone rather than anything petroleum based. Okay, so that's all reassembled. All right, so this, like I was saying earlier, the rubber's fine. This is perfectly serviceable. There's nothing wrong with it, other than a little bit of corrosion got on up underneath this rubber coating. And so what we did is we just took the screwdriver, we got the scale off, we examined it to make sure that it's no penetration through. There may be a few more pieces here I missed. Let me get those. And that's all we're going to really do with this. Try to save the owner some money because the part is serviceable. But what can we do to have the corrosion standard control? Well, I'm going to use this product here. I've used this before. It works pretty good. Rust-Oleum Rust Reformer. It's a liquid. And you actually don't want to do any kind of surface prep. Yeah, these child-proof locks, I tell you. Sometimes these guys get stuck on here. All right, guys, sometimes the caps on these get stuck, so I had to really work on it. All right, so it comes out like a white milky color, and you want to have all of the rust remain. So if we zoom in here and we pull this little piece of rubber out of the way, if I can do it with my left hand here, we're just going to get all this into the corroded metal area. And what this chemical does is it reacts with the rust, the iron oxide, and it converts it into a phosphate-based material, and that thereby stops the corrosion process. Now, don't dip this brush back into the main container. You want to get enough on here to finish whatever you're doing. Without doing that, if you think you're going to need more, you should pour it into a little plate or something. All right, so once that's set up, now it looks white right now, but what will happen when it dries is it'll turn black. And then we can give it a top coat of a little bit of paint, and we'll seal up this rubber here, and then we just save the owner the cost of replacing the strut mount on this side. We won't be able to save them replacing the one on the passenger side. I think that one's shot. I guess I shouldn't say that till we get it off, but it didn't look salvageable. This one does. Okay, that's it. We'll wait for this to dry. We'll seal it up, and I'll show you what the final thing looks like. We'll reassemble everything. All right, guys, let's get this put back together. So we're going to be using a AC Delco 505-520 or a GM 2206 4573. So this will be the shock assembly itself. It'll come with a new nut. It'll have this little spacer that you can discard. We'll take the old nut and we'll put it on the old shock so we don't get them mixed up. So we talked about before is this little indentation is going to line up with the bottom spring. We've also cleaned the bottom and the top spring of any debris. Now what we want to do here, we don't know how long this has been sitting, so we're just going to activate it a few times just to get all the hydraulic fluid and any nitrogen gas it may be charged with moving around and circulating. Old parts like this, you don't know how long they've been sitting on the shelf. All right. And we'll slide it into our spring assembly. So it's going to sit right there. Now we're going to put the other pieces back together. So we've got this bellows piece, and now that we have this on here, we'll be able to correctly insert these. In fact, to tell you the truth, I think what I'll do is I'll just take this out and I'll put it on beforehand, because it's like a friction fit here, right? So this is neck down, and then it gets to be a friction fit right there for this guy. That's neither here nor there. Let's go ahead and get this back in. And you can see our strut mount. Everything's turned black. We'll go ahead and hit that with some rust reformer black paint on the top and bottom, but we'll go ahead and get everything installed first. So remember, for this piece here, we're going to want to line up our paint mark. All right, so there's our paint mark. Going to need to get a little bit more travel out of this to get enough threads. Let's see if we can get this on without the washer. Well, yeah, we don't have enough threads to get the washer and the nut. I think I'm just going to put the nut on for a moment and see if I can get this to squeeze down a little bit. And then we'll have an opportunity to take it off and get the washer to fit underneath it. Once we get this sorted out and situated, we're going to need to torque this nut to 63 foot-pounds. This piece here, you might think you could use a socket, but once it gets kind of tight, the center strut's going to start turning. So we're going to need to use our other tool to hold it down. Let's see if that's enough to get our washer in there. Yep, okay. All right, so we're just going to fast forward through this piece, guys. I'm going to do one more check to make sure that we've got this where it used to be with our paint mark. And let's tighten it up. And this back here, just make sure that that's against the stop as well. And then I'll show you how you can get the torque wrench in here. All right, so at this point she's turning around on us. All right, so now we're going to get the torque wrench and finish it up with the 63 foot-pounds. All right, guys, the dealership, GM dealership, would have had a tool that looks very similar to what I constructed here out of an extension and a flare-type crowfoot, and that would have sat on here while they had a special tool to hold the top. So this will do the same thing and still give us the ability to get the correct torque. Of course, I'm going to have to stand up and hold our spring compressor at the same time. Almost, guys. All right, we got it out of our spring compressor. Actually, I was wrong about how it attaches. The bellows, it actually goes past this lip, and then it holds on. Now it fits just fine. All right, so let's get it reinstalled. All right, guys, we hit this area with the black paint. Everything's torqued down now. Just want to reinstall this little rubber cover. It should move like that, but it shouldn't come off. So now we're going to run this stud up through the hole for the nut, and we're going to have a helper put the nut on while we hold it. All right, with that 13 millimeter nut on, come back down and get this 18 millimeter bolt threaded through. You can lift up like you can see me doing here. I'm lifting up on the control arm with my knee just to get it started into the captive nut. On this 2004, the nut on the other side is welded into the control arm. All right, so now we're going to go back up and we'll put the two 10 millimeters in the top, and then we'll snug everything up, all three bolts and the nut, and then I'll come back with a torque. All right, guys, let's take a quick look at the service manual for this particular vehicle and this particular section. So when we're doing a shock component or spring replacement, you need a spring compressor. I have an aftermarket one, but there's a J45-400 is what the dealer would use, much more bigger and more complicated than what you'd want to use as a DIYer. And then after you get ready to reassemble all the pieces, that strut mount gets tightened to 63 foot-pounds, like I mentioned earlier, just showing you where that torque comes from. They mention here about disposing of the old shock absorber and drilling some holes in it. The place I'm taking it to recycle doesn't require that, but maybe the place where you are does. And so I'll just leave this information on here so you can do that to let the nitrogen out and drain the oil before you recycle the steel that it's constructed of. If we turn a couple of pages back and we take a look at the installation procedure of the entire assembly, that lower 18 millimeter bolt is going to go to 51 foot-pounds. That's this guy right here to the captive nut. And then the two 10 millimeter bolts are going to go to 18 foot-pounds, and the one 13 millimeter nut is also going to go to 18 foot-pounds. All right, let's put this bottom 18 to 51 foot-pounds. There we go. And now let's do the two 10s to 18 foot-pounds. All right, guys, 18 on these 10s. All right, now we go up and do the nut. All right, guys, a deep socket should just be enough to get the torque wrench in here. 18 foot-pounds. That side's done. Put this back up and let's move on to the passenger side. All right, guys. So we're all done on this side. 200% better looking than it was before. So driver's side done and all torqued down. Let's go finish up the passenger side. All right, so this passenger one, guys, is a different story. So we can see that this lower piece is split and broke that holds the bellows, just like on the driver's side. What's happened is the corrosion has pushed it through and busted it. And this mount is just completely corroded, right? So it's falling apart. But more importantly, if you look down here, the mount has separated. So this is the source of our noise. This mount, the rubber has broken between the two pieces of the bushing and is coming apart. This whole thing is, just getting ready to completely separate, so we'll have to definitely replace this. We'll go ahead and separate it, get it on the spring compressor, and go ahead and separate the pieces like we did on the driver's side. I'll show you the part number for the replacement, and we'll go rebuild this one as well. All right, with the passenger side disassembled, guys, next to our new one, you can see this one also has the rust jacking underneath that has split this retainer that helps hold the bellows piece in place. So again, that plus no doubt some leakage internally is a reason enough to warrant replacing the unit. All right, guys, here we've disassembled the passenger side, and we can see this bushing is all separated here. If we zoom in, right, so it's all separated here. We don't just have the rust jacking, it's actually into the body of the bushing. So you can see it's all corroded and flaking out in there as well. So this one definitely needed to be replaced, unlike the one on the driver's side. And we're going to replace that with a GM 2272 1046. As you can see, this one is no rust, obviously, and our bushing's intact. So we're going to mount that on top of the spring as we install the new shock on this side. I've already shown you the assembly and the torque values. It's the same as the driver's side, so I'm not going to show that again, but let's get this all back together and then we'll wrap up. All right, so we've got the passenger side in. We've got the bellows attached to that little mounting piece. Obviously, we got everything torqued up. Same torque values that we gave on the other side, 51 for the lower, 18 for the 210 bolts, 18 for the 13 millimeter nut. So everything's done. So guys, I hope this helped you out in getting your shocks refreshed, and if necessary, also refreshing the strut mount at the top. If you got questions or comments, leave them below. I'll try to help. If you found this video useful, it saved you some money, pay it forward and hit that like button. I'd really appreciate it. And as always, thanks for watching.